previous video was long, and the one I uploaded is actually the shorter one. It's actually very long, like over an hour. I had to cut it. And coming off from that video, we ended with this graph, which uh, which is complicated, at least to look at. Now, the full graph is this one. And last time I was explaining only this part because this is basically our fundamental experiences are. This part I will explain this one in another time, uh, rather differently. Uh, you can go back to this uh, graph later on if you want, but I will explain this section not using this graph. But I hope by way of doing that, when you go back to this graph, uh, you can already have a meaningful understanding of what this graph is all about. So it just looks this complicated. I mean, Lacan himself struggled to explain this entire graph, and he actually spent a year trying to explain this every twist and turns of this arrow. So what I'm going to do today is just recap some of the more important stuff from the previous video. Now, what I want you to retain from that video will probably be the one which I'm explaining something about the anxiety of us being thrown into a world and uh, the experiences and the engagement that we have within that world. The anxiety caused by this vastness of the world we are thrown to. That's one thing. Um, the Heideggerian analysis part, you can also have that one because I will be using those um, terminologies, things like Dasein, um, thrownness, or being in. I will be using that in many videos that will follow. Uh, so you might as well review that part if you have to. Otherwise, not necessarily uh, something that you should memorize. Uh, we are still right now dealing with who am I, if you notice. Starting the first video with who am I, the two perspectives from which you may want to stand upon in order to answer who am I. And last time, I was talking about who am I in a sense of being mediated by the big other, society or culture. Um, but that's an oversimplification of what the big other is. It's mostly society, culture, even religion. If we are to follow a bit from Durkheim, Emil Durkheim, if you've heard of that guy. Anyway, not important for now. But say the the idea really is that uh, you're answering the question, "Who am I?" You're not necessarily getting the answer from within you. Like there's, I think I mentioned this one before. There's this imagination that there is you at the surface level, and then there is you in the subconscious or unconscious level, right? So you are not taking your answer, "Who am I?" from the inner you. There's always this imagination that you are uh, covered with layers upon layers of masks and all that. Uh, you're not getting it from there. So today, what I will do is explain this one a bit further, and hopefully this will be a shorter video than the previous one. So what I will do is I will count this one out first, and then I will try to simplify this by removing these arrows here, because this one actually makes it complicated, and this one is just the path of self-realization and fantasy. So I will take this one out, but know that in every projection, every time you look at yourself from the point of view of a projection, meaning from the point of view of a future. Like say, if you want to be an engineer, a historian, a philosopher, uh, I don't know, whatever you want, as long as it's, as I've mentioned before, as long as it's realistic, uh, that character formation, this one, this is the I mediated by the big other. This character formation is usually based on one hand, an imagined version of yourself, and on the other hand, a self-realization of the things you were wrong about regarding your fantasies, your dreams, your hopes. This is more like expectations, reality. Expectations, reality. This is mediated, of course, by the big other. This big other, of course, is your snap back to reality kind of thing. And then out of that, you will have realizations that needs to be, well, out of your own. You will realize that these realizations, or older realizations, needs to be corrected. These are misrecognitions. These are misunderstanding. You always have an understanding of yourself, but sometimes it comes to a point when you realize that you may have a misunderstanding of yourself. So these are internal mechanisms, really, out of your fantasy and imagination, the way you project yourself. I will remove this one first in order to be specific as to what really affects your voice. Remember that the end product of this graph is your voice meaning your voice within your community, your voice within your group, with your friends, or your voice in the academe, so on and so on. That's one of the end product. The other end product is, of course, uh, your idea of an I, who you are, or who are you, um, or answering the question, who am I? So I will get rid of this one first, so that we will have a simplified version um, of this graph. This one. So now I've removed the internal part. Well, not necessarily just the internal part. It's more like the imaginative, self-realizing, fantasy-based section. Although you will realize in the future that what I just said uh, has a bit of misrecognition itself. But in order to simplify stuff, I'll have to remove them first and focus on this. Now, last time I was explaining what this is, the BART subject. And we already know that the BART subject ended up BART subject because of language. because of culture. Once you are embedded in, once you are inserted into, language will inscribe itself, or language and culture, society will inscribe itself, will inscribe itself in you, in a sense that you will somehow feel a certain degree of a sense of loss because language, culture, society, the world in general is too huge that you will have to keep on asking yourself, what is expected of me in this world? It's like you asking society, what do you want from me? What am I supposed to do? So there's a portion of you that you may be certain of, but then there's a portion of you that you're not really, there's certain degree of uneasiness in it that you don't know what exactly are you supposed to do in this world. That's the reason why you need guidance from your parents, from religion, and later on from schools, in order for you to figure that one out. That is, of course, your encounter with the big other. That's where you begin your journey towards the big other. Okay? So the more you ask, the more you go in this direction. Now, the big other is to simplify this one. This, when you say the big other, now what Lacan would really just say in terms of, say, comparing it with Heidegger is just it's you and that aspect of you which is in the world, right? So you are in the world. You're not just Dasein, but you are Dasein in the world. You're here in this world, and this world is the big other. This one. This is culture, uh, history, um, tradition, etc., etc., so on and so on. It's literally like everything that is somehow in the world with you. So now this, if you look at this graph, you notice that when you are producing your I, this one, again, this I is mediated by the big other already. So the graph, if we concentrate on this flow, you have this one and that one. So what this graph is all about is just basically answering who are you, who you are, or asking the question to yourself, who am I? Answering the question again doesn't mean there's something inside you that needs to come out. It's not like that. It's more like constructing something out of the materials that is outside of you. That's the idea. Now, you notice that this arrow kind of like contradicts or going in the opposite direction with this arrow. This is the arrow of the signifiers. Hmm? This one. Signifiers are like, these are words, signs, uh, concepts, words like love, for example, or hope, or faith, or nation, or democracy, so many of them. You kind of like, uh, you you are being plunged into a pool of signifiers, or what Lacan would say, the signifying chain, or the chain of signifiers. This arrow. This one is heading, if we uh, take out the curve, this is heading in that direction, while this one is heading in that direction. But this arrow kind of looks back at the big other at this position, right? So it's looking back at the big other from this position. Now, what is this part? This part is, as I've said last time, the dialectical point. A signifier gave you an understanding of what the big other is all about. And you begin to interpret the big other based on this signifier. Now, what does that mean? So it is at this point that I will have to explain um, this section here. This arrow, this one, explain this one uh, and the dialectics that is involved. Okay, so I'm going to explain this in terms of the experience, of love. Right? Now, why love? Well, first and foremost, love is a signifier. Uh, it's not just a signifier, but I will explain this one later on in terms of a master signifier. Master signifier is a signifier that is so ambiguous, so grand in nature, that it becomes ambiguous enough to 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 receive multiple other signifying chain. What does that mean? It will receive multiple meanings depending on context. Well, all signifiers are like that, but there are just huge words like love as a master signifier. So I will start with love in explaining this. Okay, what is so dialectical about love? Now, when you hear the word dialectics, you're usually um, reminded of this idea of, um, if you're not familiar with this one yet, we have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now, what these notions are is something like this in a very simplistic way. You have, for example, uh, a given idea, and this one is opposed by another idea. So these are contradictions. They're contradictory. They oppose each other. And this is the thesis. This is the antithesis. And out of this kind of um, opposition, you produce a synthesis. Okay. Now, some people would attribute this one with Hegel. And, that's really bullshit. Uh, no, it's not. This is the usual way dialectics is understood. Uh, we we will be using that one, but it's kind of complicated once you figure out the nuances of dialectics. And I will try to demonstrate this one in terms of this um, this section of the graph. Okay, let's move to love. I will not define love, but I hope, I will let it, as a master signifier, I will let it speak for itself. Now consider, for example, that you are experiencing the world. This part. You're experiencing the world, and in that experience, everything appears to be contingent. When I say contingent, every things just happen. Like my usual example for this is, um, let's just say this is the timeline of your life. Like you're answering the question, "Who am I?" and then you're imagining your timeline. Here, you are, say, you just entered high school, and I don't know, something happens while you are in high school, like an event A happened when you are in high school, and then there will be multiple events in this one. Say, I don't know, I can't think of an example right now, but let's just say event A, B, C, D, and E. Now, these are events that you can remember out of your, let's just say, high school experience. And you are in college now, say, and this is event F. Now, all of these events, as they happen in your life, maybe they mean something, maybe they don't. Let's just say they just happen, and they just happen. I mean, things happen, shit happens, things like that, things of that sort. They just happen. And then early on in your college life, you you fell in love with some. Okay. I remember, I'll just use my typical example. What if you had a best friend since elementary, right? And there was no um, kind of like sexual tension in that friendship. Well, friendship itself is a sexual tension, but you know what I mean. You do not see yourself um, rather sexual. Like you are not sexually attracted to the person, right? And then all throughout, you went through high school. Now you're in college, and it's something happened. Something, I don't know. Some would say something. What's the term? Something like an earthquake. Something like an eruption happened. Somehow, at this point, this is point G. This is event G. At event G, you fell in love with your friend. And then at that point, all these events, maybe events that the two of you experience all throughout, all these events will be given meaning by this event. You look back, and then, contrary to what you felt when you were experiencing event A, event B, C, D, E, and F, contrary to that, because when you are experiencing these things, they appear to be contingent. They are not related together by cause and effect. But when you eventually experience love, all the preceding events, meaning your own personal history, is given meaning, given shape by love. They are not contingent anymore. They become necessary. Now, what does that mean, necessary? I'll just put it down. Here, when you're experiencing the event,
you feel its contingency.
Meaning, there's no rule, no law, no reasoning, no cause and effect kind of idealized structure that will explain why such an event happened. They just happen. Now, of course, there are causes and effects, right? Like it could be, just something small, right? So things do have cause and things does have effect. But what I mean here is the connection from A to B, from B to C, C to D, E to F. They don't have a straight line cause and effect uh, rational explanation. Things just happen. They are contingent. But when you start falling in love, you begin to interpret all these events by looking back. These events become necessary. What does that mean? I would never have fallen in love if there was no event F, which follows from event E, which follows from event D, which follows from event C, so on and so on. They become necessary. Events from your past, from your history, becomes necessary from the point of view of the event. And if we consider here event G as love, that is the event, this one. And love is, as I've said, master signifier. More on that later on. The event itself is so traumatic because it it's like a cut in the normal flow of your life. Love happens and it changes the way you look at things. What do we mean by that? Now remember this graph. S here, this one, stands, for example, in this example, stands for love. Right? So love, as a signifier, begins to affect the way you experience, the way you engage, the way you look at the big other. Your culture, your history, your tradition is affected by literally this very subjective experience called love. So this is the reason why this arrow here, as a continuation of this arrow, appears to be looking back. So you're going in this direction and then bang, an event happens. A signifier, in a sense, arrested the way you look at things, the way you look at the world in the Heideggerian sense. The world you are in is now being determined by your projections of what love is. The mood that you are in will eventually also shape the way you engage with people around you. This is this arrow. You begin to change that. And out of this experience, the result, of course, is this, your eye. So what happens in this experience is that out of the chain of signifiers, you eventually pick on love, experience. This is the power of signifiers. Well, how powerful it is. Now, even up to now, it's kind of difficult how to define love. Out, meaning outside of experience, outside of your engagement in the world, there would be no way for you to define love. That's how signifiers work. They work, they operate inside of contexts. And that context, of course, is your engagement in the world. So what is so dialectical with this? Now, this line, this one here, this is your, normal line. This is your timeline. If you are at event F, which did not necessarily make you look back, no, because it's just regular things that happen in life. You got drunk. Nothing special about that. Maybe for some people, but it's not enough to. No, you got drunk and then you eventually turn around and look at everything that happened in your life. It's not that overly dramatic, right? But when you're in love, it does. It does have that um, effect. Uh, what Roland Barthes called satori. Right? It's this little crack in the plane of your existence. And something erupted, something happened. The event occurred. And that event is you. That is you being in love. And this runs contrary, this one runs contrary to all of this. This is normal life, regular life. Life flows. You wake up, you go to school, you do your work, you go home, do your homework, you sleep, repeat, right? Rinse and repeat, as they would say. This is normal life. This is not normal in this sense. Not in a metaphysically way of saying that this is not normal, this is abnormal, because falling in love is also part of life. But as a subjective experience, this is a bizarre experience. As I've said, love is traumatic. That's the reason why people remember their first experiences of this. Not because you ended up heartbroken and you ended up in a trauma, but it's really that. It's traumatic. This is your thesis. This is your antithesis. Love is the very antithesis of your life so far in this example. Your existentially put, your obscenely regular, mundane life was broken by an event that is so powerful that it made you change the way you look at the world. This is your antithesis. This is your thesis. This is your antithesis. But at the same time, this is also your synthesis. Because the synthesis is a way of looking at the same thing in a different subjective standpoint. So you get the idea. This is not the usual, if you look at here, dialectics. This is not the typical, oh, I have a thesis. Oh, there's an opposing idea. And what do? We meet halfway and produce the synthesis. No. Hegelian dialectics was never like that. Right? Here, it's not a kind of going halfway or meeting halfway or we consolidate each other in that sense and then produce synthesis. Here, what actually happens is some event turns the entire field, this one, this field of your own history into something different only because of this event. And this event is love. And this is the dialectics. Okay? So this is the synthesis.
This is the antithesis, and this is the thesis. Now, what this means is the synthesis and the antithesis are basically the same thing. Because what happens is the antithesis is being used as a medium in which I will begin to look at the world differently than normal. You're in love and you're beginning to interpret the world rather differently. And this is the reason why people would say, okay, my friend fell in love with that friend, and then after that everything changed. Things change, right? That's the idea. And this is also the concept of this portion of the graph. As you live through life, entering into the big other, experiencing and engaging the big other, you have a normal life until you eventually caught on a signifier so, again, so powerful that it changes the way you look at the big other. And out of that comes your voice. It's precisely that the signifier with a signifying chain so powerful, that's where your voice comes out. And this is where people will say, that's very subjective. Of course it is. There's no escaping that. There's no reality of the entire human engagement. There's no reality that is not mediated by the big other or culture in general. No. So out of that comes your voice, meaning when you speak, when you explain, when you look at the world, when you try to describe the world, it will be based on this signifier. Now, you can replace love with, say, nation, for example. You become a nationalist. Your signifier is nation. That concept will change the way you look at the world. Things like communism, feminism, capitalism, and all those isms and philosophies, these are signifiers with, with very powerful implications that they will have to change the way you look at the world. You cannot, or let me rephrase it, you cannot live life anymore as if the event did not happen. This is the reason why I think I mentioned last time, there's no turning back. There's only a moving forward. There's no turning back from this. Once an event occurs, you can, an event meaning just like love, event G here. When that event occurs, there's no turning back. That's that's how powerful it is. You cannot pretend turn. Well, of course, there may be unconscious stuff moving around, but I will explain the unconscious in the next video. Here, let's just do with what we are actually conscious of in our lived experience, in our engagement with the world. Right? Not just the voice is also produced, the again your eye. Now you see why the eye cannot be fixed. There's no I that is the essence of your life. Now, no such thing exists. The I is always changing. You cannot say, uh, oh, I cannot be this kind of person because I am another kind of person. No, everything can be changed. It's just a matter of whether or not you reach a point of epiphany, for example. Well, epiphany in life is also an event. That's why you call it a life-changing event. Not just in a way of moving forward, but also in the way of looking backwards. When your life is changed, the rest of your past will become, in a way, implicated to the changing meaning of your I. How you define your I, how you look at your I, will be defined by the signifier, excuse me, that you caught. in this process of being thrown into the world, if you remember. This line is being thrown, you or us being thrown into the world. And in that thrownness, we engage the big other, culture, history, tradition, whatever you call it big other in general. And then we caught because the big other is really just this huge pool of signifiers. Somewhere out there, we will eventually get caught by a signifying chain out of a signifier that will literally make us change our lives. And from this point, from the point of realization, this one, causes and effect became necessary. They are no longer contingent from point A to point B. They should happen. If something from point A to B to C to D, if any one of those or anything of those goes missing, you cannot be at point G. So everything is necessary. Cause and effect appears to be overly determined from looking back. That's the dialectics. Dialectics is just basically looking at things differently by a kind of change from the standpoint of, say, from a conservative standpoint to a different standpoint. Just changing the way you look at things, or what Professor Zizek would say, uh, looking awry. You're looking at the same thing, but from a different perspective. One way of putting it would be like the parallax. Right? You cover one uh, you cover one of your eyes. Say you cover the left one first. You're looking at the same thing. So you're looking. Let's just say you look at the object in front of you, and then you cover your left eye, and then after that you cover right eye. You're literally just looking at the same thing, only at a different angle. That's the dialectics. This point is what use a different color. This point is the dialectical point, as I've said. Lacan called this one the the anchor point. The anchor point is the point of dialectics. That's the point where you change the way you look at the world. Okay? Now, probably some of you, excuse me, some of you are history students, will realize what this means in terms of history. The way you write history, the way you interpret history. Because if history is a voice written on text, that voice is never objective because there's no objective ground from which you can stand on. It's always mediated by the big other. Of course, you cannot go full blown fantasizing. Let me go back to this part. You cannot go on with this. You cannot say, for example, your voice, your history cannot really be just this pure fantasy. It has to be mediated by the big other. So once you write it this way, the voice will emerge, fiction, some sort of, well, at least the generally accepted idea of what fiction is. Okay, so That's the production of the uh, this the your I as mediator. Now, speaking of love, I will have to add something here about another master signifier that is, I don't know, seldom taken seriously. Uh, Sex. Now, I'm not talking about the sexual act, although that is, of course, a traumatic experience. If the context is there, uh, but when I say sex, this would be the kind of identification of being male and being female of that sort. And the event of sex is for some people almost naturally biological. The the labeling to some degree is biological, but I will out of love I will explain sex. I'm not implying something, but that's just how and unconsciously. But anyway, let me go to Richard Dawkins. Now, if you don't know who Richard Dawkins is, he is an evolutionary biologist. If you're an atheist, you probably know about him already. He's one of those more radical, rebellious atheists. I know in the past 10 or 20 years, uh, he wrote books like The God Delusion. If you've read that book, I read that book. Didn't enjoy it that much. Uh, I'm an atheist, but I don't belong to this kind of atheism. They are fun. Uh, they're fun to listen to, sometimes to read, and I did not really enjoy reading The God Delusion. Um, I, I come from the tradition of a Nietzsche, of a Heidegger, of Marx or Freud. So um, I was not fond of. But these are most of the books he wrote were about atheism, like The Greatest Show on Earth, or The Blind Watchman, or The God Delusion. Mostly these are atheist books. The God Delusion, of course, very openly atheist. But the most favorite book that I've read uh, from Richard Dawkins is The Selfish Gene. It's nothing to do with atheism, but this has something to do with evolutionary um, biology, study of genetics. It's a very nice way to, well, at some point, Dawkins was a professor for public understanding of science, and his objective was to simplify science for the common people. And there's a way of saying that one in a Lacanian way. I'll not go to that. I will go to that in the future. But the selfish gene, if you notice the title itself, this is a kind of simplified way of explaining how genes work. And if you notice the title, The Selfish Gene, you can already see the effect of the big other in this. Scientifically, there's no such thing as the selfish gene. Genes are not conscious enough to be selfish, to identify themselves as selfish. But the title itself means that in our understanding of the genes, we are already inscribing our own culture, our own language, our own tradition into the explanation. And that is, of course, because Dawkins was trying to explain how genes work using the way we explain culture. The irony of this book is that he will eventually explain, a kind of redoubling, he will begin to explain culture in the way he explains genetics. Right? Although that's speculative, but he did have some points which are similar to Lacan. So I will start with the idea of how powerful the big other is. So if you still have trouble what the big other is, Dawkins has a way of putting it. He consider his explanation of culture and how he in this paragraph, you take the time to read this paragraph. He actually moves from the use of the word culture to the use of the word language, as if culture and language are taken together as a single whole, which is not necessarily wrong. What makes us unusual compared to the other species in the animal kingdom is that we do have culture, we do have language. And as Dawkins pointed out, uh, so if you're still having trouble what the big other is, Dawkins would say fashions in dress and diet, ceremonies and customs, art and architecture, engineering and technology, language, history, science, all of that is what we consider the big other, culture in general. And the thing with this section here, this is actually the first time the word meme enters into contemporary usage. It's not the same way we use the word meme today, but more or less this is the first time it's being introduced, supposedly, albeit not that famous, but the word meme. He used the word meme to coincide with the word gene. If genetics has something to do with our natural evolution, memes has something to do with our cultural evolution. And in this section, what Dawkins is trying to say is that our cultural evolution is so fast and changing, and it does not seem to have a particularly definite kind of pattern. Even if we say, okay, the sciences before are not as advanced as the sciences now, but that's basically all there is that we can say to imagine a kind of progress. But in terms of how cultural evolution works, it seems to jump, it seems to slow down, it seems to jump, it seems to slow down. There's no particular pattern as to what we're doing. And sometimes the use of fashion does not even replicate the one that we can see in the animal kingdom. That's how weird human beings are. We seem to escape the, the, the genetic control that is supposedly keeping us within line of the natural evolution things. Now, what Dawkins will say in this book is that the more you look at human culture, the more you begin to see that genetics play a very small, minute, almost negligible role, especially when we speak of our cultural behavior. And of course, in this chapter is going uh, to speculate on what he calls his theory of memes regarding an explanation of human culture. And at the very end, uh, Dawkins will have to say culture is a very different kind of universe in itself. It's like, for example, right? In this in this section, he will explain, for example, genes will eventually change all throughout, such that useless ones will eventually disappear. But here, in our culture, if you write a poem, and if that poem becomes, in Dawkins' way of saying, mimetic, or in Lacan's way of saying, if your poem becomes a master signifier, then that signifier will become, as long as human beings exist, will become immortal. Genes are not immortal. Memes can be. Or, again, the uses of, or Dawkins's use of the word meme is almost similar to Lacan's use of the word signifier. And Dawkins's meme pool, it's a pool of meme, a pool of cultural behavior, sound, production, music, books, texts, um, ideas of what is appropriate, what is not, all these things. This meme pool for Lacan is basically just the chain of signifiers. Right? So, what does that mean? Culture is very powerful in determining what we are. Genes, they seem to be placed in a very peculiar position, as Dawkins himself will write in this book, panting to catch up to cultural affects. Meaning, there's a huge gap between, well, of course, we are always affected by genes, the color of your skin, the color of your hair, the color of your eye, the shape of your eye, the number of fingers that we have, all these things. But outside of that, the determination of what we are in answering the question, who am I? Genes have very little to say. And with that, we go back to what I said, sex. Now, in this book, let me go back to the table of contents. In this book, Dawkins will explain in chapter 9, Battle of the Sexes. This one word. In Battle of the Sexes, what Dawkins will explain is something like this. In the animal kingdom, there appears to be a kind of pattern, but not necessarily followed all the time. Meaning, there's a pattern in which males follow a certain degree of behavior and females follow a certain degree of behavior. But even in the animal kingdom, there's no universal rule that would determine what males ought to do and what females ought to do, what males ought to be, what females ought to be. There's no general writ in stone definition, a universal function inscribed into what we can say as female and what we can say it's male. In fact, Dawkins will say that the only difference between male and female, not even considering organs here, that the only difference is the number of sex cells. It's the only difference, really. Other than that, none. So, genetically speaking, your being male and your being female has nothing to do like biologically speaking. It has nothing to do with how you culturally behave. Right? Because Dawkins will say, aha, even in the animal kingdom, there seems to be a kind of, there are patterns that are met and there are patterns that are not met. Uh, it depends on the animal, it depends on the habitat, it depends on the ecology, it depends on the place where the animals live, the kind of environment that they are. There's just too many variables to check in order to qualify that if you are male, this is the specific behavior. If you're female, this is the specific behavior that you have. It gets more blurry when we deal with human beings. So what? Um, Now let me just go. I think this video is getting too long than expected, but let me go to the last part of this one. Now, in this last part of the chapter, Dawkins will then say that in some cases of birds of paradise, the typical male would be the more flamboyant one, the more colorful one, because it competes with other male. That's one variable. The females, not so much. In birds of paradise, the males are, let me just say, the males are bright and ostentatious because females are in demand and can afford to be choosy. You cannot say this with modern Western man, as Dawkins would say. Because Dawkins would say, if you look at our culture, the more flamboyant one, the one who wears makeup, the one who wears more colors, the one who, let's just say, show more like an event in themselves are the females. And Dawkins would ask um, three questions at the end of this chapter in a very funny way. I don't know if he's being sarcastic about this, but he would say, what has happened in modern Western man? Has the male really become the sought after sex, the one that is in demand, the sex that can afford to be choosy? If so, why? Meaning that we somehow the somehow the males have become reflective of some of the females in the animal kingdom, while the females in our society have become reflected of some of the males in the animal kingdom. As I've said, nothing is written on stone. And what Dawkins is saying here, coupled with the idea that culture have so much effect in the way we figure out behaviors of males and females. What he's trying to say, and um, or what Lacan's most famous expression would say, there is no such thing as sexual relations. There's no such thing. Right? There are other examples Dawkins provided here, like for example, a horse impregnating um, a donkey, which is an extreme form of interracial sex. There's no written rule in which a donkey will say this is inappropriate. The same way with the horse. One can say that science can explain sexual difference in a biological level, but the relationship between the difference. In the difference, there's a space for meaning, but the meaning will not be provided by biology. The meaning will be provided by culture. And this is where Lacan's famous expression, there's no such thing as sexual relations, actually stand. What Lacan means is that if you're a female, if you're a male, there's no set rule of relations that you should follow. There is no, aha, if you're female, this ought to be your behavior if you're a human being. If you're male, this ought to be your behavior if you're a human being. None of that exists. So how do we figure out our um, roles in terms of sex? Same way as this graph, we take it from this one. We take it from this one. It is the big other that influences us in terms of sex. Yes, you are labeled male and female, scientifically, biologically speaking, but that's the end point for genes, for genetics. Beyond that, when you start calling male man and you start calling female woman, when you, in some sense, begin to use gender over sex, that is already cultural, social, historical, traditional. In a sense, that's the function of the big other. And that's basically how I will end this video. I hope it's not that long, but I have to be very, in a way, very specific now in terms of this graph to help you answer who am I, to make things more complicated. Next, in the next video, I will be explaining the unconscious, fantasy, and well, there are actually so much more I can't remember now. So that's it. See you all in the next video.